Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the REAP session on political economy. We'll have 3 presentations here. We'll start with Cláudio Ferraz, who will present a paper on internet, social media, and the behavior of politicians, evidence from Facebook in Brazil. Then we have Lucas Novas from INSPER, who will talk about the violence of law and order politics, the case of law enforcement candidates in Brazil. And then we have Felix Schonenberger from the Universidade della Svizzera Italiana, sorry for the pronunciation, who is going to talk about identifying the effect of election closeness on voter turnout, evidence from Swiss referendum. So I start by thanking the authors for agreeing to be here to present the papers. And we've agreed that we will have about 25 minutes each to present the paper, followed by a couple of questions. And then if we have some time in the end, we also have some questions, okay? Thanks very much. Let's start with Cláudio.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, but it's a bit oh, now it's better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so 25 minutes, right?
Sure.
Okay. So let me start by it's a great pleasure to be here, even though from far away. But thanks, Naircio, for organizing the session. Great to be here with Lucas and Felix. So I'm going to try to this is a long presentation, so I'll try to shorten it up. I might jump around a little bit, but I want to make the main point across. So this is work together with Pedro Bessone, Felipe Campante, and Pedro Souza Pedro Bessone at MIT, Felipe Campante, John Hopkins, and Pedro Souza at Warwick. And it's a paper about internet, social media, and the behavior of politicians. So we don't have a lot of time, so let me get straight to what the paper is about. So I'm going to start just motivating what we do in this paper. So there's a pretty large literature about the role of information as a key in holding politicians accountable to voters, right? So for decades and decades, there has been a growing number of papers showing how, for example, newspapers, radio, and television, by providing information, improves the accountability in democratic systems. So we have done work on that for the case of Brazil. Jim Snyder and Dave Stromberg has done that for the case of the US. There are multiple examples where traditional media makes and imposes checks and balances in the way that politicians work. Now, what has happened, as you all know, in recent years, is that there has been a really massive switch, both in terms of the penetration of internet and the penetration of social media in all countries around the world, but also a pretty large change in how citizens consume and use information. And this change basically has 2 main effects. One is that nowadays you have way more information than you used to have, but also information has become less precise. So we all aware, for example, during this pandemic, on the spread, for example, of fake news, right? And what fake news can do to electoral accountability. We're not going to focus on that in this paper. So this is a pretty important question. People have been working on that, both in political science and in economics. Is the phenomenon that's going on is not what we're going to focus on this paper. We're going to focus on a difference component on the spread of social media, which is this idea that now with social media, politicians can communicate directly with voters. So what social media does, if you think, for example, about Facebook, which is the specific example that we're going to be talking about in this paper, is that it allows for politicians to have direct communication with voters And you can think of this communication either as propaganda, something that, for example, can make propaganda about what the politician is doing, or you can even think about information as the politician is gathering information from voters in a good sense, right? So the big question that is like behind what we do in this paper is this question of whether the spread of social media, is it a boon to accountability or a threat to democracy? Of course, we're not gonna be able to answer this big question. We're gonna put like a little piece of an answer into this question by looking at a specific example of Brazil. So let me jump into Brazil. So why is Brazil interesting? Well, Brazil is interesting to look at this because, first of all, is one of the largest users of Facebook around the world. So the US, India, and Brazil are the top 3 users of Facebook across the world. But it's also interesting in the sense that politicians took over Facebook very fast. So this is a picture here. It's a little bit of a misleading picture. There's some fake news here because there's a picture about the recent legislature, which is not the one we're going to be looking at. But it just gives you this idea of how people are in Congress voting and discussing and then lively transmitting stuff to voters. Something that's a little bit more closer to what we're going to do is this type of use of Facebook, where this deputado federal here, this federal congressman, sent money to a specific hospital, and then he goes to his Facebook page to say what he did, the amount of money of his emenda parlamentar, his budget amendment that he sent to a specific locality, and he's going online to make propaganda about that. So this photo here is actually going to be part of the data that we're going to put together and use. This idea that politicians go on Facebook to tell stuff what they're doing, and they're trying to signal to specific localities that they're working for them. Okay, so the idea of the paper is to try to understand how do politicians respond, not only to the growth of the internet and social media, but specifically what we're going to be looking across Brazil, across different locations, is really comparing places where internet enters, which allows people to use social media through their 3G internet phone, and places that still don't have internet. And we're going to try to understand how politicians behave in those specific places. So we're going to exploit the expansion of 3G mobile phone network in Brazil between 2010 and 2014. I'm going to show you a couple of maps in a second. But the idea is that until the late 2000s, you almost didn't have mobile internet that had access to data in Brazil. And it really starts slowly after 2007, as I'm going to show you. And there's a huge expansion between 2010 and 2014. So between 2010 and 2014, municipalities that didn't have the network of 3G mobile all of a sudden become connected. So what we're going to look at the behavior of politicians on Facebook. And we're first going to try to answer the question whether once a municipality gets connected through the 3G network, do politicians engage more with that municipality online? And by online here, we're going to be focusing on Facebook, which is our online measure, okay? Then we're going to ask a second question, which is the following. Maybe they get and they engage more with voters online, but they have a different behavior offline. So we're going to try to contrast what politicians do online in terms of communication vis-a-vis what they do in their traditional behavior are federal congressmen. And we're going to focus on 2 measures. We're going to look at speeches. So these are floor speeches they make on the floor of the Congress, whether they cite or not specific municipalities. And one of the main variables here is going to be a real variable, which is the allocation of discretionary funds across municipalities. So for those of you familiar with the Brazilian context, these are the emendas parlamentares, which are the part of the budget that's discretionary, that at least at this time used to be discretionary and choice, right? And politicians can decide whether to put an amendment into the budget and where to send that amendment to, like which municipality and for what. So it can be to build a school, it could be to build a road, it can be to buy an ambulance, it can be to a bunch of stuff. Okay? All right, so without going deeply into the literature, what we do in this paper is contributing to a very fast and growing literature on the role of new technologies and social media in politics. Most of the work out there, which is actually well summarized by this recent survey by Ruben and Nikopolov and Qualters in the annual review, is mostly focused on how voters or citizens react to the entry of technologies, broadband, mobile phones, and social media. So a lot of the work out there is like, does it increase turnout? Does it affect how people vote? Does it affect protests, etc.? There's very little work looking on the other side, which is how do politicians react when internet and social media gets spread out in a country. The only exception to that is this paper by Gavazza and Qualters in the research, where they look in the case of the UK and they look in the displacement that internet did to the traditional TV and how it affects some incentives of governments to tax and spend in a different way. Okay, so let me quickly tell you what's the variation that we are using here, and then I'll get into the data. So until 2005, there's very little mobile internet in Brazil. The change occurs in 2007 when Anatel, which is Brazil's regulator, does a large spectrum auction and auctions out 11 service areas. A second auction takes place in 2010. So the auction in 2007 and the 2010 auctions are really the ones that change internet 3G in Brazil. And what's important here is that when firms won a block of the spectrum to have the service of internet 3G, first of all, in each block of the spectrum, there was competition, like more than one firm could win. For example, I don't know, to be a São Paulo provider, right? You wanted to have several firms competing. But not only that, what's also important is that if you won a rich region, for example, if you won like São Paulo, the firm that won São Paulo, I think was Vivo, you also committed to then connect poor and unconnected regions. So for example, you had to connect part of the Amazon. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing that's important is that the telecom regulator introduced targets of the expansion of 3G over time, where you have to connect a given number of municipalities over time below thresholds of population. Okay, so for example, the small municipalities below 30,000 people, you had to connect 20% of those by May 2013, 75% of them by 2016, etc. And then there was an ex-ante list where each firm had to connect a list of municipalities over time. So there was very little discretionary power to choose where you're going to connect or not. This is just to make the point that it's going to be very hard here for example, politicians to interfere whether Claro is going to connect, for example, one state and municipality first vis-a-vis in the state, another municipality second. This is all a little bit predetermined given the rules and the regulations in place, okay? So as a result, what you have is this connection. So what we have here in white are places that were already connected before 2011. And here, 2011 is going to be the mandate that we're going to look at here. And then places, as you get darker and darker, that gets connected over time. As I'm going to tell you in a second, we're going to use as a control group, not places that were already connected in 2011, because those places were richer and larger. They're going to look very different than the others. But our control group is going to be here, places that didn't get connected up until 2014, that we know got connected later. That's going to be our control group. So massive expansion in access in this year. So this is just, for example, a measure of total access in 3G, so that you have a sense in this period how massive the increase is over time. And the only thing I want to note here, although we don't have data on Facebook use by municipality, this is data here from Latin Barometer, where you see this massive increase in the share, which is the data that we have, the share of use on Facebook. So for example, you start very little in 2009. There's almost no Facebook in Brazil. People used to use Orkut. And then by 2010, it becomes small. By 2013, 40% of people are using Facebook in Brazil, according to Latin Barometer, and these things keep increasing over time. Okay. So what we're going to do in terms, let me just keep track of time. What we're going to do in terms of data very quickly is we're going to use data that's publicly available. We go into the pages of all deputados federais in Brazil, the federal level legislators, and we scrape their Facebook page. So we get everything that's in their page, including all the text, all the posts, all the likes, all the shares, all the comments, everything that we have there. And we're going to do text analysis to look at first, when is a municipality cited by a given politician and what is it cited for? So we're going to know that, for example, I don't know, Porto Seguro in Bahia is cited by politician X and is cited because this politician is saying that he sent money to that municipality to build a school. That's the type of information that we're going to have. Okay? So over time, you have this massive connection. So you start basically when almost there's no Facebook, 0 politicians have a Facebook account. By the end of the 2014, which is the mandate that we're looking at, more or less 70% of the deputados federais, the federal congressmen, had a Facebook account. Okay? And of course, over time, there's a massive increase also in the mentions of specific municipalities, as you can see in this heat map, comparing the first year of this legislature with the last year of this legislature. Okay. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Brazilian electoral system. Probably everybody except Felix knows well about that. The only thing that's really important for us here that's different from other countries, such as the US or the UK or Canada, whatever, is that we have an open list proportional representation system, which means that a bunch of politicians represent the same state. And that matters because that's going to create variation on what's the basis of voters for different politicians. So what you can do is that you can calculate the vote share of a given politician. So here's an example, for example, for São Paulo, where you have 2 of the most voted federal level politicians, Tiririca and Gabriel Chalita. And you see that they have very different patterns of vote, right? So for example, Tiririca, the votes are spread across all municipalities, where you see that, for example, Chalita, the votes are concentrated in some specific municipalities. That means that, for example, say internet 3G enters this place here, is going to affect way more Tiririca, the politician on the left, than, for example, Chalita, the politician on the right. And we're going to exploit, that's going to be part of the variation we're going to exploit in a triple difference in difference in difference, right? So we're going to compare places that get connected before and after, and then interacted with the share of votes that a given politician have in that locality, okay? All right, so on top of that, we're gonna get data on the amendments that politicians place in these localities, which are the discretionary funds, and we're gonna also do some text analysis on the speeches that politicians make on the floor in order to know whether they're citing or not a given municipality, okay? All right. So I was telling you before that we're going to use as a control group places that were not connected up until 2011. And the reason we're doing that is that you observe places that were already connected. These places are way richer and have very different characteristics than the other ones. So we're going to throw away these places and we're going to focus on the places that were not connected up until 2011 and only use the variation of those that get connected in the period compared to those that only get connected after 2014. Okay? So I'm gonna start just with a basic regression just to convince you that the difference in difference just using aggregate variation works in the sense of pre-trends. And this is how it looks if you use the switchers, never takers, and the others, right? So for example, if in blue dots here are the comparison between switchers and never takers. So this is the comparison that we're using. If you use the other ones that I'm throwing away, the pre-trends, they don't work very well, right? So this is in part why we're throwing away those places that were already connected before 2011. Okay, so let me first tell you what are the municipality level results, and then I'm going to interact with politicians. The municipality level results, and this is just a figure of the event study, is that once you get connected, the activities of Facebook, of politicians towards a connected municipality increase significantly. So a municipality gets connected compared to the other that doesn't get connected in the same state, then politicians start posting more stuff towards that municipality. They get more likes, they get more comments, and they get more shares. And these are just the equivalent coefficients to that regression, but I'm going to go quickly because we don't have a lot of time. On the contrary, when a municipality gets connected, speeches seem to go down, politicians seem to cite less the municipality, and transfers, although it's not significant, they go down at least in the period T+1, although in the second period on the aggregate you see that it doesn't matter that much, right? So, but in terms of, for example, speeches, you can see already that even in the aggregate data, there seems to be something moving in different directions. You communicate more towards a municipality online, but you cite less that specific municipality offline. All right. Now, of course, what really matters is how they cite municipalities depending on where their votes come from. So now we're going to estimate a regression where we're going to interact with how important a given municipality is for the politician. And what we're going to find here, so you can see here extensive margin in the top, where we just, because there are tons of zeros, we just use a dummy, or intensive margin in the bottom. And again, municipality gets connected and he had a lot of votes. So it was a municipality that was important for that politician. The politician tends to cite more the municipality online, but have a lower probability of sending an amendment to the municipality and have a lower probability of citing the municipality in a speech. So there seems to be this opposite direction where once a municipality gets connected, the politician engage more online with the voters, say more stuff online, but switches both the speeches and the transfers away from municipalities that are connected towards municipalities where they got a lot of votes, but those places were not connected. Now, these effects, of course, you can look at the effects on average, but because the share of votes are very asymmetric and nonlinear, some of the politicians get a lot of votes from fewer states. What we do is a more flexible specification when we estimate this effect along the quantiles of vote shares. So here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever are the quantiles of vote shares. And what we see is that the top quantiles of where the politician got a lot of votes are exactly the quantiles where you increase a lot your activity online. And on the other hand, you decrease significantly your activity offline. So in terms of speeches and in terms of transfers, you observe this decline happening in the top deciles of, I said quantiles before, but we're really doing deciles here. So it's in the top deciles of the vote share distribution. So in places that you get a lot of votes, you take away transfer from those places and you send to places that you got votes, but places that are not connected before. Let me just check. I have like 3 minutes, I think. Yeah, okay. So this effect is robustness. So there's a lot of robustness that we do, and I don't have time to go into it, but like setting activity, you put 0 missing if you don't have a Facebook, weighting regression, excluding municipalities. There's a lot of stuff going on, excluding neighbors. If you think about like spillovers, that a cell tower connects other people. So we do a lot of robustness for the results like that. The second thing that we do that's interesting is that we get into the topics. What are politicians citing in those places? And what we find is that mostly is stuff related to the amendment. So if you see in the top deciles of the distribution, the type of keywords that are cited in the posts in the Facebook by politicians are things related to health, education, and infrastructure projects. And of course, the word amendment, because a lot of the money they send to these municipalities go through amendments. Okay. The last thing that I'm going to show you is that the decline that you observe in real money that you transfer into other places seem to mimic the topics on the discourse. So there you say more that you like education, you're doing stuff for education, medical doctors, whatever, but in practice, what you do is that you're taking away money from those places in those areas and placing that money in localities that don't have access to information. So there has been kind of like a trade-off between online and offline behavior of politicians. So the way we finish the paper, I think I have like 1 minute. The way we finish the paper is writing a very simple model to rationalize this behavior, where you can think of politicians as competing across different municipalities and having two instruments to get votes. One is pure communication and the other is transfers. And the difference between communication and transfers is that when you're doing communication online, you're reaching voters that are already in your core set of voters, right? Because they're following you already on Facebook, they already like you. I mean, of course, we all follow Trump or Bolsonaro just out of curiosity, but most of the people that follow politicians is because they like them. So we rationalize this as you communicate with your core voters and you use the transfers in order to get voters from your core supporters. So nice, I'll finish that, and then if there are questions, then we can go over the questions.
Okay, thank you, Claudio. Just one quick question that I had is, do you observe a decline in the number of speeches and amendments, or do they stay constant in this municipality by politician, I mean, and they increase in the municipalities not connected?
So, I mean,
is there a substitution effect, or maybe because there is 3G and Facebook, they don't do any speeches anymore, or do they transfer to the not connected municipalities?
So it's a tricky question to answer econometrically, in the sense that because we're estimating a difference in difference, all the coefficients here are relative, right? So if you just plot the absolute numbers, you do observe an increase, right? But in terms of like the coefficient, it is a relative coefficient, right, with respect to the control group. So it's really with respect to the control group that the unconnected. So what seems to be happening is not that they're substituting away for places that don't have, where they don't have votes. It's more that comparing to places where they have little votes, they're making more speeches in places where they got a lot of votes, right? And less speeches in places where you have now the 3G connection. So it's all relative to places where they have little votes. So their behavior is changing in comparison to places where they have little votes. And they seem to be, compared to those places, then in places without 3G internet connection, they make less speeches and they send less emendas parlamentares, and they do that more in places where there is no 3G, but they got votes in the past election.
Okay. Yeah, it would be interesting in the descriptive to see if they are decreasing the number of speeches. And
yeah, no, I agree. We need to do like some of those like more descriptive graphs using like the different groups, because I think it's easier to get a sense of the effects.
Thanks. Any more questions?
Se alguém quiser fazer pergunta em português também, podem fazer, viu? Não fiquem tímidos, não. A gente traduz para o Félix.
Well, I have a question, Marcio, Claudio.
Yes.
So I had the impression, and I go kind of in the direction of the more descriptive figures as well, I guess. I had the impression that the major expansion in Facebook predated a little bit this because it was actually through like home internet, right? Home-based internet. So I was just wondering to what extent the 3G actually increased the volume of like traffic in Facebook and something along those lines. I don't know if you have something.
So we don't, but it's very small, right? So if you look at some of these numbers here, the share of households, for example, see this green line here, the share of houses that use mobile internet in the PNAD to access the internet in Brazil is like, in 2013, it's like 16%. So most of the internet access in Brazil is not through broadband. It's very small, the broadband, right?
Oh yeah, but before the 3G, it was more, right? Relatively, at least.
No, but then Facebook didn't exist, right? So Facebook enters in 2010. So there's no Facebook in Brazil before 2010. The main registry in Brazil was between 2009 and 2010, right? So the expansion of 3G in Brazil that starts more or less in kind of like 2008 was still a little bit small, right? The share of municipalities connected before 2010 was like less than 20%, was very small. So it's really a coincidence, right? That the boom in 3G and the Facebook boom happens more or less at the same time, but it's a coincidence that's good for us in that sense. But it is kind of a coincidence.
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, so thanks very much, Claudio. There's a question in the chat as well, if you want to take a look, and then maybe we come back in the end. Lucas, can you do your presentation, please?
Yes, sorry. Let me just find the right. So are you guys seeing it?
Yeah.
Great. Let me. Okay, okay, now I can see you. Great. All right. Well, thank you, Narcio, for the invitation. It's great to be in the SCBN, and thanks for all of you to come and see us. So my name is Lucas, and I'm actually a political scientist, so sorry to barge into your conference. I thank Narcio for allowing me to speak here. And well, the paper that I'm presenting is about law and order politics and law and order politicians. And there's a lot of literature, both in political science and economics, showing that when you mix politics and crime prevention or law and order politics, usually something goes bad. And we have plenty of examples in Latin America where that happened, most notably in Mexico, where there was an upfront confrontation between the state and cartels. But there's a lot of politics and crime prevention and public security that we don't know. And we have to take a step back a little bit, because a lot of what we see is not really the type of violence that we see in the border of Mexico and the US or in Central America. It's more of a kind of a quotidian violence, a more mundane type of violence. And so with that in mind, I try to look at what happens when people elect a law and order politician. And this is timely because last elections in Brazil, we saw an incredible rise of law and order candidates. And that seems to be mostly this rise to the Bolsonaro effect. But even before that, and I'm not looking at the last election, I'm looking at previous elections, we see a lot of these candidates competing on Brazilian elections. And who are they? These are the type of guy that usually try to display to the voter that they're really preoccupied with security issues. And they try to really make a brand of themselves as a tough guy that want to fight crime or put the hot on a hula and stuff like that. So these are the type of politicians that I'm trying to look at. And these are what I'm really interested in trying to gauge in this paper is to see what happens after they get elected. Okay. So what is my paper in a nutshell? What happens when these guys win, right? And I'll be looking at a very specific type of candidate. I'll be looking at candidates that propagandize their issue ownership, or they showed voters they are really, they have a strong intent on working in security matters by using their previous occupation in the ballot names they put on at the electoral authority, right? So they're going to show in the ballot name that they are from the army, they're from the police, and so on. And this can be, these type of candidates are different from other candidates. First, because what is really not very common in Brazil, they are doing programmatic politics. They are telling the people before getting elected what are their intentions. And also importantly is that for a subset of these candidates, specifically police officers that take a leave to run for elections, they take with them, in case they win, the connections they have to the public security apparatus at the local level. So they still know the people in the police departments, and they can potentially influence how the police engage in crime in these places. And what is really striking about law and order politics is that, yes, we see this huge increase in violence in Brazil in the last 10 years. But this increase in violence is pretty much contained in 1/4 of the population, which is among men and non-white men. Roughly, each of these lines is 1/4 of the Brazilian population. And we see that it's very stable for most of them, but all we see is that non-white man gets killed much more often than any other, and increasingly so. And what is funny is that these law and order politicians usually don't cater for these guys. Their target constituency is usually middle class or lower class, but lower middle class, but not really. They're trying to prevent these guys from getting killed, but they're really more preoccupied in crime, in the sense of robberies and theft and so on. So, okay, just a brief overview because we don't have a lot of time. But what I find is that when these guys get elected, the municipality sees a reduction in crime, but they see much more homicides. And these homicides are usually just among non-white men. And what I find also is that these results are heterogeneous. So mostly these rising homicides occur in municipalities that elect a former or a police officer that is on leave. If we look at military candidates from the military, or former police officers that now have a second job, we don't see these effects at all. And to explain that, and I think this is like key point that I want to emphasize is that I find suggested evidence that these results are driven by political favoritism. And what I mean by that is that, well, in public policy, in any other domain, when one politician gets elected, he will try to favor their core voters, usually, right? And that should be the same thing happening in public security. But the thing is, at the local level, resources are they're very constrained. So specifically in the case of Brazil, local politicians, and I'll be looking at vereadores, so local councilmen, these guys don't have any discretion to increase the number of police officers there. They might have some discretion to increase guarda municipais, but we're looking at what I'm mostly worried about is that they use these very fixed number of police officers to favor their constituency. And when they do that, they basically have to rearrange the policing at the municipal level. And since their constituency is better off than, is relatively better off, they're gonna take police officers from places that don't vote for them, that are worse off, and put on the better off areas of the municipality. And that will increase violence in the municipality. Okay, so again, I'm gonna go very briefly through this, but there are a lot of we don't know about how politics and public security mix. And as I was explained, as in any other domain, the politicians will give precedence to their core supporters. And in public policy, this is worrisome because they have very few resources and the resources are fixed. So that will eventually entail in rearrangement. But this rearrangement will only be able to happen if they have some kind of informal influence over police resources. And I expect that police officers will have this informal leverage to rebalance the police force in the local level. Meanwhile, other types of law and order politicians won't have this ability. As I was explaining, this type of programmatic campaigning is very rare in developing countries. And this signaling and this programmatic commitment of these candidates will have an effect when they get elected. I'll be looking at vereadores, so local council, and they usually in Brazil, they have very little power. They have very little what to do with their offices. So we shouldn't expect a lot of effect among them. And the key here is that some of them have these informal channels to public policy, which is through their occupations. Okay, so what happens in Brazil? I'll be looking at a proportional representation in a different level that Claudia was telling us about. I'll be looking at the local level. And it's important to say that because there are some scope conditions for the results that I'm going to be showing. I wouldn't expect this favoritism if the politician is trying to win the majority of votes in a district. However, if he's running for a PR office, he can actually segment the voters into core supporters and swing or non-supporters and just focus on the core supporters to get reelected. Usually, local politics in Brazil is very clientelistic, so it's very surprising that we have a politician that will be working more with program. And I'm not gonna be discussing a lot. So it's important to have in the background that the organized crime exists. And in the metropolitan areas, they are very widespread nowadays. But if we look at the smaller municipalities, of course, there's crime, but it's usually not as organized than what we see in Rio, for example. Especially at the period that I'm looking, starting 2004, we don't see the infiltration of the PCC around the territory. Okay. When the way, what can they do? There's something that they can do, especially if they work together with the mayor. They can install CCTV cameras. They can expand Guarda Municipal, hire private security. Sometimes they have contracts with they have firms and work these firms with the local governments. And in the interviews, they show that they still have some connection with local law enforcement. Yet some of them, however, Thus, some of them will use these connections to influence public security. Okay, I have to go a little faster. I'm going to be employing a regression discontinuity design, and then later to probe a little bit what is really happening at the local level, I'm going to run a spatial analysis. Well, the data is TSE, it's some budgetary information, crime statistics, and homicide data from the Ministry of Health. And how I spot a law and order politician. So here is just a random screenshot of my data set. And we see here that these guys in the square, they all have something in their names that remind the voter that they're from the law and order enforcement. But they also have to self-report their occupations, and then we have that they are either from the policia or the military, and that will be useful for me later on. So basically, if they have something in their name that that reminds the voter they're from law enforcement, they're going to be a law enforcement politician. If they have that plus they're from a military branch or from the policia, the police, they're going to be either police or military. Or sometimes they only have the occupation from the law enforcement, but they don't use that in the ballot names. And those are just other type of candidates that I'm going to be looking at that I assume they don't have a programmatic commitment to law and order. Okay. So these are basically the guys that I'm going to be looking at. And once, in another lifetime ago, this guy was also a law enforcement candidate when he ran for vereador in Rio de Janeiro. Okay, so homicide data, I take like 1.8 million deaths since 2000 to build my dependent variables. I'll be looking only at municipalities that had a law enforcement candidate, and these municipalities are definitely different from municipalities that didn't have a law enforcement candidate. And as I was explaining before, the constituency of law enforcement candidates are really relatively more educated, and I think that they are relatively more richer than the average citizen. Okay, so the regression discontinuity design. Basically, what I'm worried about is that people vote for law and order when there is a rise in criminal activity. So I have to take care of that, and I take care of that with regression discontinuity design. The treated municipalities are those that had a winning law enforcement candidate, and the control are municipalities that had a law enforcement candidate that lost an election. I'll be happy to explain a little bit more of the details of the regression discontinuity, but right now I won't have a lot of time to do that. So let's go straight to the results. Basically, this is the main results that I find, is that on the left here, these are several different regression discontinuity estimations, from the most stringent one closer to the cutoff and running to the right. We find those that get more observations farther out from the discontinuity. And what I find is that there's a large increase in homicides in municipalities that had a winning law enforcement candidate. And these homicides are mostly due to firearms. I also run I'm going to be skipping most of the robustness checks, but here we see that even in very close margins and in the intent of looking at the local randomization, we see that even if we only look very close to the margin, we still find an effect. And it's not an effect on the whole population. What I find is that the effect is mostly contained among non-white men, right? So on the left here, we find that there's almost no effect, negligible effect among non-white men. Oh, sorry, white men. But non-white man really gets the brunt of it. Okay. There's some indication that crime goes down, right? And just to make sure that what I'm finding here is not just because a law enforcement agent got elected, but what I'm really interested in is that the programmatic appeals that they make before the election are really the ones that are driving the results. I look at candidates that also had law enforcement occupation, but they didn't display that on their ballot names. And here we find that on the left, this is the same plot as before. We see that, sorry, this is supposed to be ballot names. Those that use ballot names on the left, and on the right, those that didn't use ballot name, didn't have a programmatic connection to voters, I don't find any effects. I also find that, sorry, the caption is wrong, but on the left, we see that the candidates that use ballot names, so what I call law enforcement candidates, they do end up, the municipalities that elect them do end up spending a little bit more on public security. It's very negligible if you think about the amount that each citizen gets in public security expenditures from the state. But still, we see a clear intent of working on public security among these guys. And from the other guys that didn't propagandize their occupations, we find no effects. But what really worried is that what I find later before about homicides is really tied to how these candidates behave while in power. And when I separate the types of candidates between them being in the military or being the military or any other type of candidate that didn't reported that they're from the police, I don't find any increase in violence. I only find violence increasing among those candidates that are from the police. Okay, I have 4 minutes. And to really understand what is really happening, I try to look at the spatial analysis of the spatial distribution of crime in the municipalities that elect these people. And the idea here is that each of these blue dots is a polling station, right? And each of these crosses are a homicide. And what we see here is that a 1 kilometer radius. And in this 1 kilometer radius, I count every single occurrence. And the idea behind here is that I want to know whether polling stations that supported law enforcement candidates, do they get safer over time? After they win, of course. But really, what I do here is that I build this variable, which is I call police action. And what I do is I use a denominator, all crimes, all robberies that occur within that radius. And the denominator is the number of these occurrences that are flagrantes or actions that are caught in the act by the police. So these are really a record of police presence in these places. Otherwise, these crimes would not be flagrantes. So they can only be a flagrante if they are caught in the act. And the sense behind here is that I imagine, sorry. Okay, I still have 2 minutes.
Someone is with an open mic.
Okay. What I'm trying to probe here is that my hypothesis, so to speak, is that places that vote for them get safer, and to get safer, they get more. They have more police presence in there. So I don't know if you guys are from São Paulo or anywhere. I guess this is common everywhere else in Brazil. If you go to a rich neighborhood, they're going to have a little plaque over there like, oh, we report everything to crime, to the police, every suspicious activity. And usually they have a direct line. So they seem to have some special arrangement with the police, and you don't find that in the peripheral parts of the municipality. And this is what I'm trying to do here. So if this ratio goes up, the amount of crimes that are caught in the act is higher, and to be caught in the act, it indicates that there are more police there. To build this data set, I web scraped this, the Secretaria de Segurança de São Paulo, and some of the coordinates I could only get through the Google API. And so sorry about the typo, but what I find here is that among police officers, we see an increase of that ratio, where as they get more support, we see an increase of that ratio. So we see a clear, at least to me, a suggestive evidence that there is a relationship between getting safer and supporting these guys. Meanwhile, when we look at non-police officers, so the military or any other type of candidate that use a ballot name indicating law and order, we don't find any relationship at all. Okay, I don't think I have a lot of time for alternative explanations, but there's no indication that more police officers get killed and no more police officers kill more people in these municipalities. So we don't see that the increase in violence is due to police brutality or to a direct confrontation between states and the criminal gangs. So to conclude, in highly competitive races, we see that law and order candidates do follow their campaign promises. And when these law and order candidates are actually police officers, they will use their connections to favor their constituency, but favoring their constituency can result in more crimes. Well, thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Lucas. We have 2 questions already in the chat. Would you like to read them?
Let me stop sharing so I can look at. Okay. So Cláudio. Paulo Arvati. Tudo bem, Paulo? Do you have any evidence about the exchange of favors between mayors and law and order councillors? I did look at the connection between the two, and I couldn't find any indication that they work together, but maybe you can think about a better way to probe that, but I couldn't find anything that looked at the connection between the two or helps or harms public security. Diogo, could you say something about the magnitude of the results? Yeah, so basically this magnitude is in line with what Melissa Dell finds in Mexico. When we implement the robust, the non-parametric estimation, usually it's around like 15 to 10, which is commensurate to, well, if you think, it might look very large. And the thing is that these municipalities, mostly they have like 12, or the median, I think it's 12, and the average is 30,000 people. So if one of these individuals die, if they have one more homicide in the period, you're gonna see a big jump in the crime statistics. And Wagner, how do you reconcile an increase in homicides with a decrease in other crimes? Yeah, so I worry that they could be related to data reporting. That it could be that crimes are no longer reported in other areas, so there could be an effect on the reporting of crimes. And this is why I focus mostly on homicides, because homicides are recorded and it's usually the coroner that decides whether it was a accidental death or an actual killing. And I also have ways to really understand whether there was some type of manipulation or not among homicides.
Lucas, can I ask a couple of questions quickly? So I have two things. One is, it was not clear to me. So you're doing DRD with the vereador on the margin, right? As far as
Yes.
I understood. So probably matters a lot if there was no other vereador or policeman in that place, or he's already, there is one and he's like the second elected. I don't know if you like look at that, but I think that should be super important, right? If you're, for the first time, there is like an elector vereador there who is like Polícia Militar, whatever. Yes. So that should be super important, I think. The second thing is more a question about what's the story that you have in mind, right? Because in small municipalities, as you said, I mean, yes, the vereadores can do a lot of things, but some municipalities don't even have a guarda municipal, others do. So, I mean, the only story that comes to my mind, it has to be something through some type of militia, right? Or like some, I mean, if we believe the results and the results are really there, what's the alternative explanation? What's the story that you have in mind?
So for your first question, definitely. So unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of time to explain it. I only look at municipalities that didn't have, at the time of the election, an elected law and order candidate, right? And I try to do several checks to eliminate the possibilities that I'm breaking the potential outcomes here. And one of them that I'm not really happy about, I can take out any municipality that had two close law enforcement candidates on both sides of the discontinuity. But what I'm mostly, what I think it's the proper way to see it is to add this worry that you had to the idea of, like, if you're getting observations farther from the cutoff, you're increasing the probability that you're going to put a lot of other law enforcement candidates. So I will be focusing mostly at the observations that are close to the cutoff instead of relying on the observations that the municipalities that I have will only be within the study group if I really increase the bandwidth. For the second question, I think, like, I have tried a lot of stuff with this paper to really nail down this story. And one thing that I find consistently is that there's no increase in the killings perpetrated by the police. And I also find that there's no increase in the killings that are, well, basically, I don't find an increase in headshots killings. So there's no executions, summary executions that happens there. And I also don't find any increase, actually, if there's anything, there's a decrease in the killings of law enforcement agents in the municipalities. So there's no direct confrontation with with the state and criminal gangs, or militias and criminal gangs.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. Now we have the final presenter, Felix. Thanks very much, Felix, for agreeing to come. And you have 25 minutes.
Thanks to you. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks again for having me here. It's a pleasure to present you this paper, or at least parts thereof. This paper is joint work with Leo Burstin, Davide Cantoni, Patricia Funk, and Noam Juchman. And it is about estimating the causal effect of anticipated election closeness on voter turnout. So why should we care? We think it is a fundamental question. Do voters turn out more when they anticipate an election to be closer? We find it fundamental because this is a sort of a key prediction of most formal models, especially all pivotal voter models dating back to Downs. And I mean, usually this effect of closeness arises because of instrumental benefits. So if elections are close, people might perceive a higher probability of being decisive and therefore are more likely to turn out. But it could also be that, you know, election closeness could interact with other motives for turning out, like, you know, social preferences, social pressure, intrinsic motives of turning out, and so on. So on the empirical side, however, we have somewhat mixed results. On the one hand, we have observational studies that typically find positive correlations of turnout with exposed election closeness. However, it could be that these studies overstate the true effect of closeness on turnout because of omitted confounders, because you can think of issue type, for example. Very politically contentious issues are likely to produce close election results, but they might also motivate voters to turn out. Or you can also think of you know, supply side activity, like you know, if both parties or both sides of the yes and no sides, or Republicans and Democrats, invest a lot in political advertisement and campaigning, they will increase both closeness and turnout, and so the effect could be endogenous. So the estimate could overstate the true effect of closeness on turnout. On the other hand, however, we have field experimental evidence, and these field experiments find zero effects of information about poll closeness on voter turnout. Usually, obviously, RCTs are the best way to estimate causal effects, but we think that maybe in this context, it's not the best of all ideas, because, you know, in the ideal experiment, you would randomly treat voters with information on polls or election closeness and prevent the control group from obtaining the same information. And this is often not possible in the field, at least in the US, for example, where these studies are conducted. So these studies cannot control for common information sets outside of the experiment, and this could produce a downward bias of the effects towards zero. So what do we do in our paper? So we find that the anticipated election closeness really causes an increase in voter turnout. How do we do this? We leverage a novel data set of daily mail-in voting in the canton of Geneva. So the canton in Switzerland is the same as the state in the US. And so the canton of Geneva has registers incoming votes at the daily level, so we can observe turnout before and after the release of polls for the same vote. And this enables us to implement an event study exploiting the precise day level timing of the release of Swiss national poll results over more than 50 referenda. So in contrast to observational studies, we have a quasi-experimental design that allows us first to hold fixed issue type by controlling for vote fixed effects. And we can also gauge the role for the political supply side by just taking political advertisement as an alternative outcome. And also, in contrast to experimental studies, we exploit the sharp arrival of new information about election closeness by the poll release, which mitigates issues associated to common information. So, and what we find is that really turnout increases substantially in the first 3 days after the release of a closed poll. And we also find some evidence that the political supply side reacts to this, so that the political advertisements also increase, but only after the 3rd day after the poll release, so well after voter turnout already reacted. And to us, this suggests that the underlying mechanism that leads to an increase in turnout is, you know, that people update their beliefs about election closeness, and that this is not mediated by a supply side response, or maybe it could also be that it is mediated by, you know, voters updating beliefs about the importance of an issue. And so to gauge a bit more these alternative mechanisms and shed some light on this, we also used a novel data set of cantonal turnout and poll mentions in cantonal newspapers. So we all across Switzerland. And if it is true that the polls affect turnout by shaping beliefs about election closeness, it should be the case that you know, the release of closed polls matters more in locations where voters are more exposed to information. And indeed, we find about to information about polls. So indeed, we find that the poll mentions in cantonal newspapers increase turnout if polls are closed, and consistently with our channel, they decrease turnout if polls are not closed. Moreover, we also look at the effect of, you know, of differential coverage of closed polls on, you know, political ads as a proxy for supply side activity, and also on surveyed vote importance, which is a proxy of issue type, if you want. And we do not find any association to these outcomes. So what I'm going to present here is first, I think I need to give you some institutional background about Switzerland, just briefly. Then I'm going to present our main piece of evidence from the event study design in the canton of Geneva, and time permitting, also some aspects of the heterogeneous effects of poll closeness depending on newspaper coverage in the canton. So Switzerland is a federal republic of 26 cantons, and as you might know, we vote on several issues and very frequently. So just to give you some numbers, in the past 40 years, we voted about more than 300 federal ballots and on more than 100 election days. And you know, these voter initiatives and the referenda are usually high stakes and on politically diverse issues like national security, health, immigration, redistribution, everything you can conceivably think of. And to anticipate this, it can happen that on one election day that there are several ballots, and we follow just the other literature and focus on the most important vote per election day, because at the margin, probably voters will decide on whether turning out or not due to the closeness of the most important vote. So then the pre-election polls are, we have this in Switzerland since '98. And these are mandated by the Swiss public TV, and poll results are usually published 10 to 18 days before election day. And the voting process in Switzerland is very easy compared to the US. For example, there is no voter registration, and every eligible citizen automatically receives all voting documents at home 3 to 4 weeks prior to election day. And then voters can either wait and go to the ballot box at the election day, or they can use early voting by email, or more recently also internet. And most voters actually vote by early voting, and in Geneva, where we exploit this day level turnout data, more than 90% vote early, so before the last day. And what is also important, campaign advertisement in Switzerland takes place mainly in newspapers, because political ads on TV and radio are prohibited by federal law. So that's why we use political ads in newspapers as a proxy for political supply side activity. So the votes across day level data we got from Geneva. Let me just briefly describe how this looks like. So we have our main dependent variable is turnout, which is just the daily number of incoming ballots, which are registered by the cantonal service of popular votes in the elections on a daily basis, and divided by the number of eligible voters who did not turn out yet until that day. And our secondary measure, our secondary outcome is advertisements. This is just a daily count of ads in which we hand collected in the 2 major Genevan newspapers. And Then our main variable of interest is, ex ante closeness of the poll, so the poll closeness, which we just define as the predicted vote share in the poll of the losing side. So a 90-10 would be closeness 10, 60-40 would be closeness 40, and up to a maximum of 50, And yeah, we got this information from Swiss Public TV, who actually mandates these polls, and also the precise date of the poll release. So this leaves us with a panel of 52 votes, where we observe turnout 5 days before, up to 9 days after poll release. This allows us to implement a simple event study design, where we basically estimate day-specific effects of poll closeness on daily turnout, conditioning on vote fixed effects and day fixed effects. And again, the sharp arrival of new information on election closeness at the day of poll release, which we normalize at 0, mitigates this concern as common information. And our proposed mechanism of a causal effect of poll information on turnout, which works through shaping voter beliefs about closeness, implies that we should, first of all, find no effects of closeness prior to the poll release. So absence of pre-trends, and we should find some positive effect on turnout after poll release, but also prior to any political supply side response. And so we estimate this model not only for turnout as an outcome, but also for political ads as an outcome. And here are the results of the event study. What we see is, so this graph plots a day-specific effects of a 1 standard deviation increase in poll closeness on daily voter turnout. And we see that before poll release, we have basically that 0, so absence of pre-trends. And then after poll release, in the first 3 days, turnout sharply increases and statistically significant, and then it remains also positive, although we cannot reject the 0 effect. Now let's have a look at how the supply side reacts. Again, we find 0 effects prior to the poll release, which is somewhat heartening for our identification assumption. And we find that some evidence of a supply side effect which only occurs at the 3rd day after poll release. But importantly, this effect here, so this increase in political ads, may have an influence on turnout only days after. So from the 4th day after, so well after that we have seen a turnout response from voters. So to us, this suggests that we have, that the mechanism underlying this effect of poll closeness on turnout might be really that the that this new information leads people to update beliefs about election closeness, and therefore they turn out more. So to further explore a bit this mechanism, and also an alternative mechanism, we turn to our canton level data. And so if this informational channel by updating beliefs story is true, we would expect that poll closeness has a larger impact on turnout in cantons where newspapers report more heavily on polls, so where there is more information of polls disseminated. And we would also assess the effect of differential newspaper coverage of closed polls on supply side activity and beliefs about issue type, which we proxy, the first one by political ads in the cantonal newspapers, and the second by vote importance as surveyed in post-electoral surveys. So we estimate a simple empirical model. Basically, we regress turnout in a set of canton and vote fixed effects, and on poll mentions in cantonal newspapers interacted with poll closeness. And our proposed mechanism of a causal effect of poll information on turnout, which again operates through voters updating their beliefs about closeness would imply that, that we find a positive coefficient on the interaction when the turnout is the outcome, and that the associated coefficient should be basically 0 if we take political ads or vote importance as an outcome. So this data set is just a panel of 37 votes in 26 cantons. So main outcomes, as I said, are turnout, ads, and importance as surveyed in post-electoral surveys. And the variables of interest are again poll closeness or extent to closeness defined and measured as before in the event study. And poll mentions, these are the number of poll mentions in cantonal newspapers. So we considered all newspapers read by at least 10% of a canton's inhabitants, and then counted and collected the number of poll mentions in the month prior to election. And then obviously poll mentions could be endogenous to voter interests, and if newspaper editors cater to the interests of their readership, then this might be endogenous. So what we do is then we define a variable which we call incidental poll mentions, and to have some sort of a cleaner variation in poll mentions, which comes from poll mentions in cantonal newspapers, but restricted to those newspapers whose main market lies in another canton. So we say that so if you see these poll mentions as a voter, it's originated. The news originates from another canton, and therefore we think it's plausibly exogenous. So what do we find? Just let me show you the baseline results. So what we see is that here in panel A, column 1, that differential coverage of close polls indeed increases turnout. So to give you a sense of the magnitude of the effect, this means that if a poll is 1 standard deviation closer than average, and 1 standard deviation increase in poll mentions increases turnout by a statistically significant 0.5 percentage point. And maybe it's more intuitive if you show it to you graphically. So this graph just plots the differential effect of poll mentions depending on poll closeness. And as you see, if polls are very close, then we have that additional poll mentions statistically significantly increase turnout, whereas if polls are not close, then the additional poll mentions are predicted to decrease turnout. Although here it's not statistically significant. I don't know whether you can see it, but here the bars indicate the support we have in our data. So for non-close polls, we have basically little support, so therefore the effects are a bit noisily estimated down there. And also we find basically no effects on no differential effects of poll mentions depending on closeness on the political side, supply side activity, and neither on perceived vote importance by voters. So, and again, this we think that this is consistent with a mechanism where, new information about poll closeness increases turnout by leading voters to update their beliefs about the election. And just briefly here in panel B, we do basically the same stuff, just using the more exogenous or incidental poll mentions, more exogenous measure if you want so, and we basically find qualitatively consistent results and also quantitatively consistent results. So do I have some time left? I didn't have a look at the clock.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, so just very briefly. So given these results, we think that the pre-election polls cause an increase in turnout really by shaping voters' beliefs about election closeness. And we think also that this is an important existence results because it's the main prediction of many models of political elections where turnout is endogenous. So a natural follow-up question would be whether these effects are large enough to affect the election outcome. We got this possibility a bit by conducting some counterfactual exercises. One is that we suppose that there is a second closer poll which is observed only by the losing side, plausibly because voters consume news aligned with their political preferences. And in this counterfactual world, we flip 2 out of 50 Swiss referenda. Another counterfactual would be, we suppose that in some cantons, newspapers with readers supporting the losing side increase their poll coverage of the actual poll that we have to the sample maximum. And in this counterfactual world, 5 out of 37 Swiss referenda outcomes are flipped. And so we have some evidence that maybe this closeness turnout channel might affect also election outcomes. And we also think that in practice, this turnout margin will be especially relevant in politically polarized environments. If you think of the US, where it is by definition hard to persuade voters to change sides, but then the turnout margin, which you can affect by polls or by disseminating information about close polls, is much more relevant. And yeah, so I think my time is over. This is mainly the main things I wanted to say. So thank you very much for having me, and I would be glad to answer some questions or some comments.
Thanks, Felix. Does anyone have questions? I have a question on in the first exercise, do you use the turnout votes by internet, or I don't understand, because there's some selection, those people that prefer to vote earlier or close in the election day?
Yeah, so we basically use all data, just until election Sunday. These are early votes by internet or by either cast by internet or by mail. But this is not a super strong selection because in our data, so in Geneva at least, 94% of the voters turn out early by mail. So it's not, I don't think that the sample selection is much of a problem here because most voters vote early by mail.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have a quick comment. I think there has been like a lot of discussion, especially if you look at, for example, this US election, on the uninformativeness of many polls, right? Like basically people have been like more and more not getting right the predictions of elections, and there has been like pretty intense debate in the US that was like very, very intense even since the primaries, right? So it's this trade-off about aggregating information, but at the same time, if this information is not precise, then it's not clear how people are using it and the elections and things like that, right? Do you play with like the preciseness of like information? Polls have like different preciseness in terms of historical. Some of them get it right, others don't. Some use larger samples, others use small samples. Do you have any information on that?
We have information on how these polls are conducted. It's always by the same polling institute, and they do it also always with the same methods that is in like 20 years ago. So I think in terms of precision, obviously these are not super precise, but I think it's still an informative signal to, as you know, for a voter to gauge whether this is going to be close or not. I mean, they do not predict always rightly the winner or the winning side. Maybe maybe they predict, you know, it's going to be 52 yes, 48 no, and then it's instead it's 52 no and 48 yes. But still, in both cases, we would have a close. The information on closeness is quite accurate, you know.
Yeah, but my point is more that how accurate they are is important, right? So if you think about the case of the US, is if you expect something to happen and something different happen in elections, then you have a crazy guy like Trump saying like, oh, they stole the election, right? Or I mean, so as many governments are going towards this more populist style, and that's happening in many countries, then there's a trade-off here in what the polls. I know your paper is not at that, but I think for the future, this is something I think interesting and important to look at in terms of trust in government, how like this type of polls, and maybe the case of Switzerland, there's something that could be done on that, given the type of data.
Definitely, this would be super interesting. Also, another super interesting question would be, you know, polls could also affect voting outcomes through other channels than just closeness and turnout, because there's a large literature about you know, bandwagon effects and underdog effects, and also this would be very interesting to look at. But it's slightly more difficult than just closeness and turnout, to be honest.
Okay, time is up. So thanks very much, Felix, Lucas, and Claudio. I think we had 3 excellent papers on political economy, and invite you for the other sections of the Econometric Congress. Thanks very much. Hope to see you soon. Bye bye.
Obrigado pelo convite. Obrigado a todos pela audiência.
Tchau, obrigado. Thanks, Felix. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks to you.